Breaking news, 2 new Fujifilm cameras have leaked. I'm going to tell you all about them, including the 40 megapixel X-H2s that is targeted directly at the Canon R5 and the Sony A1. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, Squarespace. You need a professional web presence, something with your own domain, something that is not just social media that could be filled with ads or just completely taken away at any moment. Head to squarespace.com/Tony. Set up your own website for a personal project, for your business, for your photography, for your video. I guarantee you it'll be beautiful and easy. They have full detailed analytics, domain hosting, sell products, take appointments from clients, pretty much whatever you can imagine you can do at squarespace.com/Tony. After your free trial, when you love it, use the coupon code Tony and get 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace, and thank you, Fuji Rumors, for bringing us all of this information. First, the history of the Fujifilm X-H1. It was February 2018 when they launched this camera at $1,900. Or if you got the grip, which you pretty much needed to unlock most of its power, it was running you about $2,200. That was really bad timing because that is the same weekend that Sony launched the A7 III at $2,000. And the A7 III was a full-frame camera, while the X-H1 had an APS-C sensor, not unlike these Fujifilm X-mount cameras. This plan did not work out well for Fuji. The X-H1 was not nearly as well received as the Sony A7 III. More than 4 years later, the A7 III is still selling for about $2,000, whereas the X-H1 has been completely discontinued, and if you do find it, it's going for about $750. But even before it was discontinued, the price just dropped really, really rapidly. Fujifilm came in with an overpriced product that could not compete against Sony, who was pricing things very aggressively. But times have really changed. Prices have skyrocketed. We're no longer seeing companies really competing on good value products. In fact, it seems like everything has gotten a little too expensive. There's something unique about Fujifilm. They have different lineups of cameras within the X-mount that have different form factors, but not necessarily different functions. For example, my favorite lineup, the XT line, like the XT3 and XT4, have all these analog controls and they're styled like a retro DSLR. The X Pro line is very similar in function, but they are styled like a rangefinder with a hybrid viewfinder in the upper left corner. The XS line and the XH line look a lot like the DSLRs from Canon and Nikon, and they have a similar PASM dial, the program, aperture, shutter speed, manual mode dial that has been popular since like the 80s. I personally think that is an extremely outdated control scheme. I think Fujifilm got it right with the XT series, where they just put all the dials. They let you control everything in an analog way, but not everybody agrees with me. Some people want this PASM dial, and Fujifilm wanted to give them that with a camera that was styled a lot like those 1980s style black DSLRs. So the XH line was always meant to directly take on Canon and Nikon, but it flopped. And a lot of people said it was completely dead. But something you should know about Japanese businesses in particular is they tend not to admit defeat. They tend to keep going even when it absolutely does not make sense. Case in point, Pentax is literally still making cameras despite very little demand. So many people thought the XH line would die after the XH1 flopped, but that is not the case. It is back. And in fact, Fuji is launching 2 variations, an XH2s, which will launch first, and an XH2. Let's go over the main difference. These are provided by Fuji Rumors. Fuji Rumors says that the XH2s, the first launch one, will have a 26 megapixel stacked sensor. I'm going to talk about what that stacked means because it's pretty important. The XH2 will have a 40 megapixel X-Trans sensor. So we have a lower megapixel version and a higher megapixel version. The lower megapixel version will be video-centric, kind of like the Sony A7S series of cameras. I think that might be why they decided to stick an S onto the end, because there is already that brand association. Fuji Rumors is saying the XH2, the higher megapixel version, will have 8K video, maybe at 30, maybe at 60, and they expect the price to come in under $2,500. We already have pictures, and to me, these look like stills extracted from a video. So I wonder if somebody might be recording a video or review of it now, and some of the files leaked. I found a commenter on Fuji Rumors who actually put it side by side with the previous generation XH1, so we can kind of pinpoint the differences. It looks to me like the XH2 has a thicker body. They might have also taken away the dial that controls the shutter speed, switching between continuous low, single, continuous high, bracketing. And they've definitely changed the strap attachment to something that looks more like Canon instead of Fuji's traditional triangles. If you look closely, you'll see why a lot of people are really mad. It has a flippy screen. You know, that means it's a screen that flips out from the side like this. And either you love this or you hate it. I actually don't know why people feel so strongly about this. Like, I do lots of still photography with cameras that have a flip screen, and I just don't find it that big of a deal to flip it out to the side before looking at it. I mean, there are times when I wish it would tilt, but the fact that I go like this, it just doesn't register as a problem to me. When people are mad, they're always like, oh, it's the stupid YouTubers because they review it and they want to be able to see themselves on camera. Every camera manufacturer is building flippy screens. But I don't take full credit for the prominence of flip screens on every camera nowadays. The fact of the matter is, the latest numbers I've seen are looking like 85% of camera buyers are hybrid shooters, shooting some stills and some video. And the flip screen is extremely helpful for people shooting video. I actually find it helpful for shooting stills too. Like, I had to do some architectural photography the other day and I needed to get as far back as possible, and I had to put this up against the wall. The only way I could actually see the screen to interact with it was to flip it forward. A tilted screen, I wouldn't have been able to see it. But I also sometimes do overhead shoots like this, where it's directly over my head. And again, the only way to be able to see this is to flip the screen out to the side. Those are both still scenarios where the flip screen is useful. So I'm not saying there's no scenario where it doesn't slow you down a little bit, but it does open up a lot of possibilities. And I guess I'm just saying, don't write off the XH2 just because it has a flippy screen. You can survive this, okay? You can get over this. I'm confident Fuji is going to drastically improve the autofocus on the XH2 for a few reasons. First, it has been a weakness of theirs compared to the advancements that Sony, Canon, and Nikon have made. In our recent tests of the Fujifilm X-T4, we found the autofocus just didn't keep up. It does have human IAF, but we found a lot of misses. And part of that is probably the relatively weak autofocus system. Part of it is probably the relatively old lenses. Fuji hasn't refreshed some of their lenses like Canon, Nikon, and Sony have, and the camera can't drive the lens faster or more precisely than it was designed to do. We're not the only ones who've called out Fuji for being behind the competition, not keeping up with the advancements in mirrorless autofocus. But also, there are some easy ways to improve autofocus. We've seen this from Olympus and Panasonic. Pretty much, if you just crank up the hertz on the processor in there, you get better autofocusing performance. So it's a very brute force method. More CPU means the processing is a little bit quicker, you can do more thinking about each frame, and thus speed up the autofocus and improve the accuracy. So I'm confident this is going to be the best autofocusing Fuji ever made. I also think they're going to add more subject detection, because that is just a general trend. Every new camera now recognizes more different types of subjects, and honestly, all these camera companies just seem to follow each other. So when one company does something, everybody else like jumps on the bandwagon, and now we have camera companies that can recognize trains and planes and cars and cats and dogs and birds, and I think they're going to do that too. Certainly the XH2 will have sensor stabilization. The previous generation of Fuji's had this and it's become pretty standard. I would hope they would improve it though, because I have not found that the sensor stabilization in the Fuji cameras is keeping up with the likes of Canon, especially Panasonic and Olympus. And the fact that they do have a smaller sensor than the full frame competition means that you could actually put more stabilization on there. There is a drawback to the sensor stabilization in the Fuji world in that the lens mount is fairly small. and some of the lenses designed for it don't cast a really big image circle, and you do sort of move the sensor around within the outer bounds of that image circle. So maybe some of those design limitations will stop them from improving it, but I do hope we see some progress. Fuji Rumors is suggesting that we're going to put a CF Express card in there, probably a CF Express Type B card. This makes a lot of sense because, as I'll talk about in a second, I think we're going to see really fast video frame rates and high frames per second from these cameras, and SD card speeds just have not kept up. When I have used high frame rate cameras with SD cards, like the Sony A9 and A9 Mark II, that becomes a really frustrating experience because it can't write to the card fast enough, so even when they give it a huge buffer, you're still waiting on the buffer to unload to the card. The best solution to this is just to speed up the rate of the card. Now, it's been really popular lately to match a CF Express Type B card with an SD card. That's what Canon does with their Canon R5. And that allows you to get high throughput to the CF Express card and still maintain compatibility with cheaper SD cards. So if people have a bunch of SD cards and they want to keep using them, they can do that, or they can switch to the higher frame rate card. Now, there's a problem with that format, and if you want redundancy, if you want to write to both cards, well, now you have that performance bottleneck that happens again. And my solution for that is usually to write RAW files to the CF Express card and JPEG files to the SD card. The JPEG files are a good enough backup for me generally, but I do prefer to have two CF Express Type B cards like in my Nikon Z9. So I'm hoping they give me two CF Express Type B cards, but they do like to keep things small, so maybe we'll just see one. Now let's talk about what that 26 megapixel stacked sensor actually means. Stacked sensors are a new sensor architecture that allows the camera to read the data from the sensor much faster. That faster readout has a whole lot of benefits to how you shoot both stills and video. Of course, if you can read that data out faster, then you can shoot at a higher frames per second. That's why cameras like the Sony A1, the Canon R3, the OM1 have those really high frame rates because they all use stacked sensors. Pretty much all the new flagships use this technology, and it is unlocking crazy frame rates. High frame rates are useful when you're not taking pictures too, because they allow you to more accurately autofocus. A lot of these mirrorless cameras autofocus by basically taking a picture, not storing it to memory, but then examining that picture, figuring out where the eye of a subject is, like doing subject recognition, and then figuring out whether they need to autofocus front or back and double checking that those adjustments are actually getting the subject in focus. So if you could read out from the sensor 120 times per second, then you could read it out several times, making adjustments before you snap that one picture at 30 frames per second. Stacked sensors and that fast readout also reduce the viewfinder lag. There's always a little bit of delay with mirrorless cameras between the time that a subject moves and the viewfinder here creates an image and sends it to your eye. And that means that tracking moving subjects can be pretty hard, especially action, sports, where these high frame rate cameras are really supposed to shine. And in the olden days, when the first mirrorless cameras came out, you might see half a second lag. And that'd be okay for taking portraits or something, but if you were shooting any kind of action, especially with a telephoto lens, you would just lose the subject. It's gotten better with every generation of camera, but nowadays it's so fast that I really don't perceive it in the big flagship cameras, and this stacked sensor will certainly allow us to really reduce the lag. I will say, my X-T4 down there in sport finder mode had almost no lag. At one point I went through and measured the lag on all of them, and it was the best. It was better than a Sony A9. So I know Fuji appreciates lag and they know how to reduce it, and they will certainly do that in these new high frame rate focused cameras. The last benefit to stacked sensors is reduced rolling shutter in video. And if you aren't familiar with rolling shutter, I have a whole video that you can watch. But basically it means if you whip a camera around, if you pan really quickly, straight lines can become diagonal lines. And nobody really likes it. I think everybody accepts it. I see it all the time, even in big feature films, there's rolling shutter. It's not that big of a deal, but people who are serious about video, that's one of the metrics they look at and helps them choose between cameras. So now I'll compare the video-centric XH2s to the stills-centric XH2 based on what I think we're going to see. I'm taking some guesses here. We know that XH2s will have a 26 megapixel sensor, stacked sensor, and I think it's going to be a bare sensor rather than the traditional X-Trans sensor. I think that because it's video-centric, and the X-Trans sensor could introduce some weird artifacts for video. The fact of the matter is, sticking an X-Trans sensor on a video-centric camera introduces a lot of risks where videographers might reject it, from things like pink teeth that I've frequently had happen when shooting with an X-Trans sensor. They use bare sensors on a lot of their cameras like this XS10, so I think they'll do it here too. I think we're going to see 4K at 60 frames per second, read full width from the sensor. So that only requires about 12 megapixels, but they'll be reading from about 18 megapixels of this 26 megapixel sensor, and then squeezing it down. And what I found on cameras like the Canon R6, this actually really improves the sharpness that you get out of it. And so I'm excited to see the quality of that video, because I think it'll be higher quality than most other 4K 60 cameras. I think it'll offer a raw video option, but I'm not completely sure what formats it will be. Raw video has become this differentiator of all these flagships, and so I think Fuji will want to jump on this. And I think, I'm just guessing, that it'll offer 4K 60 raw, but with a crop, like doing a one-to-one readout from the center of it. And maybe that won't be super useful, but it will allow them to advertise raw video. The other possibility is that it will do raw video out to an external recorder, something like the Atomos Ninja through HDMI. That's become a pretty common solution, but plan on seeing some raw. I'm confident we'll see 4K at 120 frames per second, but I do think there'll be a video quality compromise. I think this is going to be priced really, really well at about $2,300. This is Fuji's attempt to break into the video-centric market, and they can't go head-to-head with something like the $2,600 Canon R6, which is what we frequently use for video, because they don't have full frame, because they don't have such an established market for it. But if they price it right, they can make a good alternative. Let's talk about the XH2, which will be released a little bit later. This is a high megapixel camera, which I've waited so long for from Fuji. So many of their lenses are so sharp, so great. But up until now, we've been limited to just 26 megapixels. And especially as smartphones get better and better, we need those extra megapixels to really differentiate the quality of the images that we get. And I'm glad to see that Fuji is addressing that. Now, that is going to be an X-Trans sensor, according to Fuji rumors, and I'm not happy about that. I just don't see any of the benefits that people talk about with X-Trans. And I'm a guy who pixel peeps for a living, right? I've often found negative artifacts from X-Trans, and I've never seen any positive benefits from it. But X-Trans is Fuji's signature. They put a lot of marketing dollars into talking about its supposed benefits. And so I do believe they will stick that in the XH2. Fuji rumors is saying it's going to have 8K video, and they're pretty vague. We don't yet know the frame rates that it's going to support. I would bet that they're not going to do 8K at 60 frames per second. I mean, technically the Z9 does 8K at 60 frames per second, but it's limited to their proprietary RAW format, and I don't think Fuji is going to be developing their own proprietary RAW format to make that any easier. And as a result, I don't think we'll see 8K 60, but I do think we'll see 8K 30, certainly in like H.264, H.265 compressed, but maybe in RAW. Like the Canon R5 can do 8K 30 RAW to its CF Express card. So I think the Fuji might be able to do it too. In a way, the RAW is actually a little easier. It requires less processing because you don't have to compress it. You just dump it right to a memory card. And if it does have CF Express Type B, that should open that up. Now about the price. Fuji rumors said it was going to be under $2,500, but if these rumored specs are true, with the 40 megapixels and the 8K 30, and when you factor in the supply limitations, massive inflation that is happening worldwide, I think $2,500 sounds too low for a camera this capable. I think it's going to be higher. I think it's going to be $2,800. And I know from working with so many camera companies that they often don't finalize the price until like the day before launch. Like when they're printing materials, they often genuinely do not know the price until the very last minute. Sometimes they're just waiting for competitors to announce other products. So for that reason, I think it's going to end up being higher. I actually think that's the way Fuji squeezes the most profit out of this. And maybe it'll still be a good enough camera that it'll pull some competitors over to it. Fuji rumors also says there's going to be not one, but two vertical grips available for the XH2 cameras. Now, the XH1 often shipped with a vertical grip because the battery that the XH1 came with in body was not powerful enough to drive the high frames per second. It also didn't have like a headphone jack. So Fuji answered that by providing a separate battery grip that had those features built in. I guess they didn't want to actually make the body a little bit bigger in order to incorporate those things. It's entirely possible Fuji's going to do this again. You will have to buy the vertical grip in order to unlock all the capabilities. In fact, that might be how they're getting to that lower price point, by requiring you to spend an extra $300 or $500 on a vertical grip in order to actually access those capabilities. So maybe my pricing suggestion of $2,800 will be with the vertical grip installed on it. Fuji Rumors is saying there's going to be two grips, one at a lower price point, one at a higher price point. Here's why that might make sense. The lower price point one could be a very simple battery grip with no battery, so you'd have to buy a couple batteries itself, and it's got a shutter and a dial. Chinese companies make these things for like $50, so it doesn't have to cost a lot. The higher end model might actually add more features to it, like improving the frame rate. It might have external ports like XLR ports for high quality audio. That makes a whole lot of sense, especially for the XH2s video-centric model. Fuji Rumors thinks the XH2s is going to be announced May 31st, at the end of this month. And we don't know when they'll ship, but I would bet it'll be at least 3 months out from that, because that's pretty typical nowadays. And then the XH2 will be coming sometime later in the year. In the comments down below, I'd love to hear what you think. Would you buy an XH2 or XH2s? Is Fuji making the right choices? And are these enough to pull in people who might buy Canon or Sony? Or is this just meant as an upgrade path for existing loyal Fuji owners? Thank you to our sponsor, Squarespace, which makes websites extremely easy to set up. I find it completely infuriating when a business I'm trying to use only has social media. Like if you want to know the hours of a restaurant, you have to go to a Facebook page, or a general contractor who does not have their own domain. Their email is literally yahoo.com. That is so unprofessional to me. Everybody needs their own domain, their own private website with no social media advertising. So get started today at squarespace.com/Tony. Find out just how easy it is to have a professional web presence that can't be taken away at the whims of Facebook or Twitter. When you love your website, use the coupon code Tony and you'll get 10% off. Please subscribe to this channel to see our upcoming review of these two new Fuji cameras. Give me a like. Bye.